I'm going to just start by asking Scott, firstly, how are you since we last spoke? Any exciting updates? What have you been up to lately? Apart from obviously translating Epictetus, what's been new in your life?
Thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for taking time out of busy lives to talk with me and want to hear a lot of what you have to say back. We're the Stoics now, and so we're the ones keeping this tradition alive. And so our critical conversations are the ones that keep this tradition going. So very much keen on engaging with your reason. So I'm great. I've got two projects with Bill Stevens, Stoicism related. One of them was this translation and commentary, which is very, 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 very close to being done. The translation's done, and commentary is getting pretty close to done. We're in the middle of writing the last chapter, which is the sort of the consistent problems with Stoicism and attempted answers. And I've got a long list, partly because of the fact that despite the fact that I'm a practicing Stoic, I also am a skeptic. And in some ways, like Cicero was, I'm someone who's very attentive to the problems that the tradition has, and particularly core versions of it. A lot of the ancient ones have got challenges that I think are significant for Stoics to have to answer and to maybe even make certain concessions on. So that chapter is exciting to write. It's challenging to write. And then Bill Stevens and I are also editing a special issue of a journal that's actually going to be open access, so anyone can have it. It's not going to be behind a library paywall. On contemporary Stoicism, Kai is contributing a co-written essay on Stoic religious views and environmental ethics. And we've got a handful of other ones. I've got a couple puzzles from Stoic epistemology. I've got an essay on that and a lot of other very exciting essays. Emily McGill, if anyone is familiar with her work on updating, you might say the sort of what Emily calls the Stoics' uneven track record on women. On the one hand, they've kind of got this, hey, women, Musonius Rufus very famously said, well, you should educate women to do philosophy. They share in reason too. So looks like they're kind of proto-feminists. But then they say things like, hey, giving into your emotions and not being ruled by reason is like being like a woman. So they've got a pretty significant bit of, you might say, ancient world misogyny, as sort of casual misogyny as part of the as part of their rhetoric. How to kind of work away the bad part and keep the good part and still call it Stoicism is part of her project. So she's got a new essay in there. Got a lot of other really exciting work in that's really kind of bubbling through, and we're waiting for final versions of those things to come back in. Kai and I had a conversation just as we started about all that, so I'm sure that he's on it. And so those are some exciting projects. I've got a handful of other things that are sort of beyond the Stoicism stuff. I got some stuff on academic skepticism, and some work on contemporary work on deep disagreements. How do they work? What are they about? How does argumentation work? What's the relevance of epistemology to our contemporary problem-solving situations today? That's maybe not something that isn't considered too academic, but at the very least, it's an academic enterprise. So got a lot of irons in the fire. Kind of exciting to be a philosophy professor. Exciting to be a philosopher these days. It's great work. If anyone asks you if you want to be a professor, you should definitely say yes. It's a great job.
Well, I certainly think that if you're working on deep disagreements, how do we get through those appropriately? Like, is there ever a time where we need that more? how to work?
Certainly feels timely. Whenever I started working on deep disagreements, I even about 10 years ago, I said, look, epistemology is a linchpin of politics. And people were like, that's what an epistemologist says, go the fuck away. And I was like, well, okay. And now everyone's like, oh, the epistemic problems of democracy. And I was like, I told you so. Oh, well.
You're the prophet of polarization, something like that.
It's like being a Cassandra. This is the problem of all academics.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I guess I want to start by asking you a strange question, but one thing that I certainly got from when we had our conversation with Chris Fisher is Chris, he's somebody who, when he's looking at this philosophy, he's in it for the real experience that the Stoics had, not simply as an academic pursuit, but as like, I'm using this in my life, I need to get something out of this, otherwise it's too far away from me. That's certainly the approach that we're trying to take in the walled garden as well. And so when we talk about the Stoic God or imitating the divine, I'm really interested in how do we understand this in our lives right now so that we can use this information. And I wanted to ask a question, not as any kind of, with no assumptions in my mind, but as an academic, how close are you to these ideas in terms of, it can be easy to play around with the ideas up in the cloud, but do you bring them down into your life? So when we talk about the Stoic God, imitating the divine, how close are those ideas to you as a person in your life?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've got really two answers. One of them is that, again, I am a practicing Stoic. I integrate the exercises into my life. My students ask me, what do you think is right? And I say Stoicism. And so in that regard, I find direction. I find a good way of articulating some of the ways that I'm inclined to see the world. In some ways, it aligns nicely with my temperament to begin with. And so in this regard, it's a sort of a boot that fits. Yeah. But I'm also somebody who, I was brought up in a religious tradition, in a Christian religious tradition, and my youth minister called me a searcher, which was somebody who was always asking questions and things like that. And that eventually just meant that I wasn't a Christian. And it turns out that it also makes me a sort of not a Stoic either. And so in this regard, again, I consider myself more a kind of a Socratic or more of a kind of a Nicodeman. Than a Stoic full on. I call myself a Stoic practitioner because those are the substantive views that I assent to. But in kind of academic fashion, it's a kind of a weak assent. It's the one that looks like has passed a good deal of the initial questions, but have still got lingering ones for me. And so in this regard, the sort of the play with the ideas element of philosophical reflection is in fact just part of, again, I'll put it in an autobiographical sense, which is just that's just the kind of person I am. I'm lucky that I've got a job that allows me to do that. And I sort of get advancement from maintaining that sort of skeptical distance from views that I nevertheless think are right. That's a sort of a weird double-mindedness that in some ways creates a sort of a number of moments that are sort of alien. But that in some ways is nevertheless one of the virtues that, given the path that I'm walking right now, are ones that sort of pay a great deal of dividends. So yes, they are real life cases. I've done the exercise of the jugs from the Enchiridion many times, and find that it yields clarity and allows me to be able to sort of savor and the sort of the poignancy of valued moments in ways that I wouldn't otherwise be able to have. But nevertheless, I think that there's something strange. There's nevertheless something strange and alien about the exercise of the jugs, right? Like this is a mortal being, right? Is something very alien about. Like it looks like you're breaking a spell that is nevertheless a natural spell, and it may be a sort of an act of reason. But in some ways, it feels like a sort of one thought too many kind of problem that happens with any intellectualist program.
Yeah. Well, it certainly seems like it's appropriate for you as an academic to hold that kind of double-mindedness. I mean, nobody wants to go to a professor and to have them say, this is the way I live my life, and that's exactly how you should live your life, and that's all that I do. You should be exploring, playing with the ideas, because there's always something new to learn. Let's dive into this idea of imitating the divine. First question for you is, where do we get this idea of imitation of the divine? Was it Plato that originally introduced us to that kind of idea?
Well, yeah. I mean, at the very least, one of the places that we can see it explicitly is in the Timaeus, where Plato talks about the fact that at the very end, it looks like one of the ways out of the sort of the gristmill of the world is to imitate the eternal things that the world is made on the basis of. There are other precedents that at the very least are sort of, if you look at them kind of squint-eyed, right, in the Greek ancient Greek traditions. look like they're sort of imitation of the divine kinds of models. Xenophanes very famously had said that if horses could draw gods, they would draw their horses like gods. The inference was that we make the gods like us. That is a kind of imitation of the divine. But one of the things that we do when we make the gods is we make them bad, and then we imitate those things. And so Xenophanes' solution is that, so, I mean, if you've read any of the Greek myths, I mean, the Greek myths generally don't have the gods behaving well, do they? They're generally not paradigms of either fortitude or sort of self-control or anything like that, certainly not justice. So Xenophanes in some ways had a version of that thought in mind too. Plato, even with the revision of how he thinks that poetry needs to work in the Republic, has that thought in mind, that we imitate, that the gods in some ways in their excellence set good examples for us. So that it's an old thought that the gods, because they're better than us, are examples to base our lives on. And the same thing should go for the heroes too. And so whenever we look to the heroic traditions, we look to them as sort of markers of excellence and success. And for the most part, these are folks who are divine, at the very least, in their sons and daughters, and touched by divine things. And so as a consequence, that long tradition, at least in the Greek tradition, is one that predates Plato, but at the very least sort of gets its full-blown version philosophically there with Plato.
Okay, and I wonder, is there any way you could give us some sort of concrete definition of divine, especially as it relates to the way that the Stoics would see it? Because it's such a loaded term. How did the Stoics see what is? Because actually, let me add a part to that question. One thing that is always on my mind with the Stoics is their definition of wisdom, a knowledge of things human and divine. And that definition just racks my brain, right? Because I know that there is so much that I don't understand about this philosophy. So I wonder if maybe you could teach us a little bit more about how the Stoics saw what is divine, and perhaps even how that relates to virtue and all sorts of things. But throw it over there.
Yeah, so I guess we'll start by just acknowledging the fact that there's a lot that we don't know about the Stoics. For the most part, a lot of our reports from them are sort of filtered through folks and in debates. So we get Cicero's on the nature of the gods, which I think is our best source for a lot of this. We get some Plutarch, and then we get some sort of offhand, sort of sideways mention-y stuff from our major ethicists in Epictetus, Seneca, Marcus. And so in some ways we don't really have we don't really have a great resource in the same way that we do for at least late Stoic ethics that we've got for Stoic theology. One of the best ways to kind of conceive of the Stoic divine is in terms of it being perfected rationality, something that is effective in directing the world, in some ways a kind of a providence. And so providence does always what's right. And then sort of downstream from that, what's piety? Piety is something like willing and in some ways honoring in light of what's right. And as a consequence of that, of what providence is, it's also willing in line with what is. The Stoic theology is kind of tied up with, and longstanding Stoic principle is that physics and logic and ethics are all kind of one symbiotic, organic whole of the system. And we can then kind of see how, especially Stoic physics, this theory of how the divine and what the world ultimately is, ties in there with ethics, that in fact living in accord with nature is living in accord with reason, living in accord with providence, living in accord with the will of the gods.
Yeah, okay. Well, I want to kind of push us in the direction of this spark of divinity within us that connects us perhaps to the reason of the whole. When we say the word reason, I often prefer using the Stoic terms, or what at least we get in the English translations of universal reason, or even thinking about reason as the natural law of God, the logos, that we have a kind of insight into because we have that capacity as human beings. And is it the case that spark of divinity within us, that spark of reason that allows us an insight into the providence of the whole, is that the God within us that Seneca talks about, that we are somewhat developing with or growing with? I'm not sure I completely follow that.
Look, I think that's a plausible line to take. I myself don't have a line to take with that, but it sounds plausible. What we've got is our capacity to reason. It looks like it has its directedness. And one of the things about being the kind of creature that we are is that we make the world in accord with us. That's what oikiosis is, that we kind of make the world our home. And that ultimately is the application of reason to our world. So oikiosis is our use of reason to make the world in accord with what we see as it needs to be. And that in some ways is not just sort of inwardly directed, which is us thinking about ourselves, but also outwardly directed, looking at each other, looking at the world around us, and the relations that we have to it. Again, Kai has done some great work in terms of us not just seeing the relations to each other, giving us duties, but also relations that we have to the non-human natural world gives us certain kinds of duties. So I think that application of reason is something that is an important one. And one that isn't just something that comes out of, you might say, the sort of artificialities of human cultures, but are saying things that arise out of our place in the universe, our place in the way that nature unfolds. And we, as a consequence, have got duties to the animals around us and to the environments. And I'm not sure how much bigger it gets.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna let Kai jump in here with a question.
Yeah, Scott, thank you very much for clarifying for people. So as you are very concise with your words, I would just like to ask a question that everybody asks me, and I'm wondering if you have a better answer than I have, which I think you might. People say, how can the divine be good if there's so much suffering in the world? So that's my first question I want to ask you. And the second one, I'll wait for you to answer this one, actually. I think I've thrown the gauntlet down at the moment. So how do you answer that question? I have my own way, but I'm wondering if you have a better one.
Yeah, so I think that, and this was a sort of a longstanding puzzle, I think. So it's a puzzle for anyone who's a theist, and so anyone who's got any kind of theism, and so it could be panentheism, pantheism, theism, monotheism, polytheism. If the gods are good, and then why so much bad stuff? You can solve that by, again, going to the sort of the Greek pantheist strategy and saying something like, no, the gods are assholes. Like, what do you expect, right? But that's not the route that the Stoics go. And that's, by the way, one of the sort of the strange things about Stoicism is that they are nevertheless religious conservatives, right? They're nevertheless religious conservatives. They think that you should still, it's almost like a Stoic still says, go to church. So I would still kind of, solution one is to say that, and so Cleanthes, it looks like Chrysippus actually seems to have conceded that the gods, that vice, again, assuming that the only bad thing is vice. So let's make that Stoic core assumption, that, and the fact of vice is clear, right? We can just look at ourselves. So in what way is vice natural? Everything's supposed to happen according to nature, and vice is supposed to be something that shouldn't happen. So how'd that happen? What are the conditions for the possibility of that? And one answer is the gods willed it. Now, again, that seems very strange. That seems like it's a reversion back to the gods just will bad things, and that makes it so that they don't actually will the good. So I don't think that that's a good solution. So for as good a philosopher as Chrysippus was, I think that is not the way to go. Ironically enough, I think that Cleanthes, so Cleanthes often gets, the second scholar of the Stoic school, kind of gets short shrift by folks because he's he's a burly guy and things like that. He's not the sort of the hyper intellectual that Chrysippus was supposed to have been. But it looks like Cleanthes has got a kind of maybe a version of the doctrine of double effect with this, namely that the God sort of wills the whole, and that the small things are consequences of the whole, but not are things that are willed by the whole. And so here's how the doctrine of double effect works. And so this is just as a side note. It's again one of these sort of relatively controversial philosophical principles, but it's a cool one, which is supposed to be that it's like being able to identify the difference between murder and killing in self-defense. Both of them end up with a dead person, right? And so you're like, look, the consequences are still the same bad. What the fuck is the difference? And the answer is, in murder, I'm out to have the other person dead. In killing in self-defense, what I'm doing is I'm exercising I'm exercising violence for the sake of some good, namely defending my person. And it just turns out that some bad happens because of that. But that wasn't the bad that's not an intended bad. I just wanted to defend myself, and the violence had to be in the service of that. And the bad was just a downstream from it. Now, I recognize that bad was downstream from it, but it wasn't something that I wanted to bring about. So you could still have the gods be knowledgeable, right? They can still be responsible, and all of these other sorts of things. But at the very least, they aren't willing a bad qua a bad. They can still will something that brings about, and even they knowingly will this thing that the bad is going to come about, but they don't will the bad. So it looks like Cleanthes has got a version of that where he says the God wills the whole, but not the bad parts in the Hymn to Zeus. So again, I think that's maybe my best shot at it, is invoke the doctrine of double effect to be able to handle that. Many philosophers are unsure about whether or not that's even a good principle, but at the very least, it preserves a distinction that we think is a pretty intuitive one, namely that between murder and killing in self-defense.
I mean, I go down the route of like the Stoic God is all knowing, because everything that is to be known is God, but not all powerful, because God can't, unlike the say Christian God can't decide, okay, I want to change the rules of the game as such. I want to change reality to bend it to some other kind of, what I think is great. So I would say, well, the Stoics never claimed that God was all powerful. God can't take itself or himself or herself out of the universe and sit outside of it, right? Which, if they were literally all powerful, they could do everything they wanted to do. And the Stoic God is not that. So like, if I said to somebody, I think it was a weekend, if you are all knowing but not all powerful, are you to blame for somebody else doing something, right? If you can't prevent it, right? Because that's part of the thing. Like, people are, well, that's a different kind of God then. Well, yes, no one said that the Stoic God and the Christian God were the same. I mean, some people do, but that is not the distinction that, as a scholar, you would draw. So that's the argument that I like. I do like that one as well, because it adds sort of string to one's bow.
It adds to the arsenal.
It does. I think it's important to have the Stoic argument, a few of them anyway.
So I wonder how consistent those two views end up being, though. And here would be one worry that I would have about the consistency between our two answers.
Yeah.
And it kind of works like this, which is assuming that whenever the God or the gods, whenever reason or providence makes the choices that it does, all of these things are effectively like being able to, you might say, do deductive closure on your commitments. And it looks like saying that, it looks like in order to be able to say that the God can't make the right kinds of choices under those conditions, means that the God can't do the kind of closure like that. So I do wonder about whether or not our answers are actually consistent in terms of what providence really is. But that might, I'm approaching the limits of my philosophical depth with that.
I have to jump in here with a question.
You and I have to exchange some emails, friend.
So
yeah, we're gonna have to.
I wonder if I throw something in here, because there's this might actually transition into this idea that Seneca gives us of being able to surpass God. Because one of the questions that I got from, I believe it's actually a kind of ancient Jewish idea, but don't quote me on that. But I asked my meetup group, okay, well, if you've got this God that is supposedly the greatest source of intelligence intelligence, biggest thing we can possibly conceptualize of, all-knowing, all-powerful. I know, Kai, you would make the argument it's not all-powerful, but okay, well, what's one thing that God lacks? And the idea was, okay, well, that God lacks limitation, right? And so when the God is put within us as human beings, right? When we participate in the activities of that God, we are giving that God something like limitation, which enables us in the long run to, in some ways, surpass the highest thing, because we as human beings already start with this ability to do wrong and right. And I wonder if that's anything along the same lines of this idea that Seneca is giving us here, that we can surpass the gods.
So let's do a little bit of proof texting on this. So first off, the line that the wise person surpasses the God in their wisdom comes out of De Providentia and On Providence. It's about halfway through that essay. And so it's pretty clear. He says, antecedat Deum, right? The Latin is clear. He doesn't say it like, it's not like a bad translation or anything like that. You outdo God. And he has another place in the letters where he says something relatively similar, that in achieving wisdom, the wise person surpasses God. And he never really explains it directly in On Providence or in the letter in any of the letters to it. Doesn't have any explanation. So there is a puzzle. And that, in fact, so what you proposed here, Drew, was the solution that I proposed in the paper, which is, you might say, sort of a credit surpassing. The credit surpassing works on the principle like this. So in another place, Seneca makes an argument. He says, look, let's imagine you got two equally well-built houses, but one's built on sand and one of them's got really great bedrock. And so you don't see all the extra work that had to go into, the house built on sand, because they had to put in piers and other things. So the two houses stand up just fine. And so in action, but the builder that built the one on sand actually deserves more credit than the one who built it on the bedrock. Because there just had to be more exercises of their rationality and their efforts to be able to go into it. And so in this regard, it's this sort of, so the thought then seems to be that the God has rationality and has this perfection by virtue of its nature. Whereas in some ways, we, in achieving wisdom, have it by, in some ways, overcoming some frailties of our nature. And so what we've done is we've made ourselves like God. In some ways, this is even Aristotle at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics says that's the best way to be, is to be like something that's not you, namely something better than you, God. That's the reason why, weirdly, his Nicomachean Ethics effectively ends with his, it's like it's supposed to, hey, live the active life. But if you made it to the end of my ethics, that means that you're the more contemplative type. Live the contemplative life. That's like an Easter egg hidden for the for the folks who read all the way to the end. But the same thing goes with Seneca, which is, look, you have a life where you live like a human, but in some ways achieving the kind of virtue that the Stoics have in mind. You do live this life that is a human life, that has all the connections and you do all the human things, but because of the exercise of reason that you've got in there, you have in fact surpassed the nature that you had originally, and you've made yourself into something different. And in that regard, you are in some ways equal to the gods. The result is equal. It's not like you surpass the gods like you're faster, stronger, smarter, or anything like that. That's not what they're saying. Again, this is the interpretive move. He never explains exactly what it is to surpass the gods. He just says, hey, in achieving wisdom, you surpass the gods. That just seems bonkers. That can't be right. And the answer has got to be something like, it's a kind of a credit argument that you in some ways deserve a kind of the bigger pat on the back. Why? Because the gods in some ways were born on third base thinking they hit a triple. You had to sort of, American baseball analogy. They have the kind of the status that they've got and the virtues that they have, but just by they didn't have to do anything. You had to do something to be able to get that, and so that seems to be the sense in which we surpass the gods in achieving virtue. The last thought here is that it requires the perfection of that. And I think that maybe the best way to even kind of conceive this is to see this really through the lens of a kind of an aspirationalist ethics. That aspirationalist ethics is something that sort of puts the good well outside of your capacities, that you strive like a kind of you strive to join the stars despite the fact that you're merely a spark from a fire. But the thought here is that the goal is way out there. And we recognize that goal is well beyond our reach and well beyond what we can humanly achieve. But nevertheless, it's something that we see within us and sort of can't help but see ourselves drawn to and see ourselves playing out. We just also know that we'll also never be able to achieve that. The last thought on this is that other traditions are rich with this aspirationalist ethic. Anyone who's familiar with the Christian program of Imitatio Dei has seen this, which is that in the late 90s, everyone had like these little yellow wristbands, WWJD. Anyone from the United States recognizes what would Jesus do was what that was for. And the answer is that like you're not going to be Jesus. You're not going to do Jesus every time, right? Like you're a sinner. There's no way that you can live up to it. But the thought was, but imitating Jesus is actually good for us because we in some ways kindle the divine that's in us, and that is a much better program. And it's better to fail at that than to do something else.
Kai, I'm going to get to you in 1 second, but I have a half-baked thought here that I want to throw out there. And then Kai, while you're asking your question, I want to find a passage that I want to read from Seneca, and perhaps Scott, you could do some Senechian exegesis here for us. But so you mentioned the Christian ethics as well, and there's just this half-baked thought that keeps on running through my mind when I'm reading Seneca, because it's so clear when you really go deep into his letters that he is wrestling with that God within him, striving as hard as he can towards that goal of achieving true wisdom, right? The embodiment of wisdom. And there's so many parallels between the Stoic framework, especially when I read Seneca and the framework that you might see Christ popping up through. And I just wonder if what you think of this idea that, okay, this is such a stupid idea, but I'll throw it out there, that perhaps Christ was the Christian saying, hey, this sage that you guys are all talking about, this unattainable ideal of achieving true wisdom, becoming divine, right? Really a connection with God. This actually happened in this person right here. And this is who we are now going to follow, because in our lives, we can genuinely aim at that because we know a human can do it.
Yes, that is not a crazy thought. That is a very old thought. In fact, that is
okay. Cool.
So I'll give you two places that. So I teach a survey of ancient philosophy class, and so I end with this. After at the very end, and say, okay, look, here's the Christian reaction to all this pagan bullshit. And so the Christian reaction to the pagan bullshit is we do it better. We do it better. The Christian reaction to all the pagan stuff is you say that you've got Socrates. You know who does Socrates better than Socrates? Jesus. You know, you've got the Stoic sage. You know who does Stoic sage better than Stoic sages? Than Cato or any of those people? Jesus. You've got the academic sage, the skeptical sage who never assents to things that they don't know. You know who does that better? Jesus. So all of these aspirationalist programs of the ancient world,
I think I'm
making
converted.
oneself
Sorry,
like God,
go on.
coming into contact with that. That is what you just said is exactly what a good deal of early Christian apologetics were doing. So Justin Martyr, Municius Felix, these folks were running this. Christianity is a philosophical program where we have an exemplar who, just like everybody else says, like you have the story about Plato is actually the son of Apollo. His mom got visited late at night. That's a long-standing story. And all of these other sort of moments where you get touched by the divine, you have Chaerephon reporting that the Delphic Oracle said cool stuff about Socrates. Pythagoras could remember all of his prior lives and all this other stuff. All of these sort of moments of divinity, anyhow. So all of these other philosophers in the ancient world had this sort of spark of divinity story and part of their stories, Jesus is just another element to this. And that was, in fact, one of the ways that the early Christian fathers had a program of apologetics. They said, look, you persecute the Christians, but you don't persecute the cynics. They masturbate in public, people. Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? We just don't show up for your sacrifices, but the cynics are jerks. But you tolerate them because they're philosophers. You tolerate them because they're philosophers. We're philosophers too, and we've got someone who's the Son of God, and he was a really good philosopher, and maybe he and in fact, Seneca. I've got a lot to say about this. You can see, and so you really, I think that you pushed a big red button. The last thought here is that the question as to how close Stoicism, in particular, it's clear that Platonism and Christianity are just made for each other. So see Saint Augustine.
Nietzsche
the question
say that
here is
Christianity is simply Neoplatonism for the people, or something like that. Yeah,
something like that.
If he says it, I can trust a genius like that better than myself. So
it's not hard to see how Platonism and Christianity are easy friends. It's a little harder to see how Aristotelianism and Christianity are easy friends. It requires a genius like St. Thomas to be able to marry those two. Mm-hmm. The question is, how well do the Stoics do well with it? And the problem with the Stoics, consistently with Christianity, was their materialism. Mm-hmm. Their God is not, the Stoics' God is a God that's in the world and of the world and is the world. The Christians did not like that thought. And in fact, another philosopher very close to the Stoics, Benedict Spinoza, was somebody who had a version of that thought and was effectively run out of town on a rail because of that thought. He thought that there was a God. He thought that the God had all of those virtues, but was nevertheless identical with the world. God or nature was his program, and as a consequence, they had thought that he was really an atheist. And that's in fact what I think that most ancient Christians, most modern Christians, if you look at Justus Lipsius, what would we call it? Flemish now, I guess. But yeah, 15th century Christian Stoic melder, and effectively the reception that he had was, not so much.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that answer. I feel vindicated in a small way, but
you're very much on the side of the angels, depending on whether or not you believe it.
Okay. Well, I'll keep on studying divinity. I'll see what I believe after 3 years. Kai, do you want to ask your question while I prepare this next?
So I enjoyed the answer. I think that Scott has said that information about Christianity and Stoicism in such an entertaining way that I enjoyed the fact that Chris Fisher and I were smiling when he was saying that we do it better. And I've never said it in any tone but dry. So I'm really enjoying Scott's humor. One button I would like to push though is that there is an argument by only some, but some modern Stoics, as in people who don't particularly see the joy, let's say, in traditional Stoicism, who say that we don't need a sage. For me personally, if we would get rid of the sage, we don't have Stoicism, right? That is literally like saying Jesus Christ drowned in the swimming pool, he didn't die on the cross, right? That to me is like the same kind of thing. But I'm curious to know what you would say to a modern Stoic academic who is making the claim, or has made the claim in the past, that we don't really need the sage in Stoicism.
Man, that is a great question, Kai. So I guess the question here is, what exactly are we doing when we say that there are sages or were sages? So are we talking about Cato? Are we talking about Zeno? So I guess the first puzzle is, are we talking about whether or not there are sages, were sages? Could we be a sage? Or are we talking about whether or not it's a sort of an intelligible, nevertheless merely possible?
Of the sage. Yeah, there is an argument the concept of sage is not helpful, and we should get rid of it in modern Stoicism.
Yeah. So I think that we can keep the concept. The question is whether or not what we mean by usefulness gets clarified. So a handful of these sort of aspirationalist examples are useful. Let's think about like being an excellent parent, right? Or an excellent teacher or an excellent student, right? All of these are aspirational concepts. As a parent, you always at the end of the day think of, the way that you messed up your kid. As a student, at the end of the day, you can always think of the extra bit of attention that you could have given to that lesson, or internalized something a little bit more. I'm still I play a musical instrument. I'm also an aspire. I was a college soccer player. I still think that I'm a soccer player. There's another sense that I'm not a soccer player, because there are people who that's football for the rest of the world. But the thought here is that the reason why we need the ideal of the perfect, whether or not we think that it's achievable, is another matter. The reason why we need the ideal of the perfect is because of the fact that we need to make sense of what progress is. If we don't have the ideal of the perfect, the only thing that we can do is think about progress in terms of just eliminating errors. We need to think of something as in terms of making progress towards some kind of goal. Even if it's infinitely far away, we nevertheless need to think of it as directed toward that. Otherwise, it's not entirely sure, we're not entirely sure what we mean by progress. We just say something. Again, this distinction between positive and negative progress sometimes needs a little bit of clarity, but it's kind of like if we think about this from the perspective of the Socratic dialogue. Socrates is trying to get us to have this knowledge of courage or virtue or justice. And we go through a bunch of shitty examples. We're just like, that ain't it. That ain't it. That ain't it. Are we making progress? In one sense, yes, right? If it's just negative, we're just like, not that, not that, not that. That's the kind of the Swiss cheese strategy, right? Where you just, the calculatus eliminatus, just find out where it's not, and then you end up, but given the fact that logical space is big, and it turns out that our capacity to make errors is really pretty profound, that looks like that's a sort of not quite the project. Moreover, we want not just to be able to eliminate all of the other possibles and then say, well, this must be it, because it may not satisfy those conditions either. We want to be able to, you might say, have this concept of being able to say the right one, the thing that we were looking for. And so I think that that's an ineliminable requirement, that we've got that kind of directionality. So we need that concept. It's like the concept, the concept of the infinite, the concept of the perfect, the concept of the sage. That anyone who's a practitioner will nevertheless look at the things that they do and say, I need to eliminate this. Why? So that I need this not, so that I can get that yes. If we don't have the concept of the sage, we don't have the concept of that directionality, it's not entirely clear where that direction is supposed to be informed by. Does that make sense? It's a kind of a transcendental argument.
No, I would agree with you, because Leonidas Consensus across his example is good health. A good bill of health. These are very American phrase. He said, as a doctor, you've probably never seen a perfectly healthy person, right? But you have to have it in your mind's eye when you diagnose someone, because you say, well, it looks like you have this problem, because in my mind's eye, I know what a healthy lung should look like, even though I may have never seen a healthy lung in the true sense of a lung, I guess. So Leonidas has put it to me, but it's hard when you hit the tidal wave keeps coming, going, actually, we don't really need the sage. Actually, there's no value in the sage, because we don't need this objective. Basically, it's an argument that there's no objectivity. There's nothing objective that we can look at and go, that's the yardstick that I want to use. So what would your argument be if someone said, well, we don't need the sage as a yardstick? So, or that yardstick, it could be anything. It could be human, let's say it could be a constitution of some description. It's not the sage per se that we need. I mean, I would argue we do need it, but I was wondering, and I have argued about it, I was just wondering what you would say. Someone said, oh, we can just remove that yardstick. We can have facts. For example, Lawrence Becker would say, live according to facts.
Yeah.
What would you say?
Right. So I guess the one of the challenges is again, the sort of, what are we correcting toward? Now, again, my argument is less about whether or not we need it, but just about an argument that we have it. It's kind of like asking, it's like, do I need the concept of plus? It was like, yeah, it was like, if you're going to do all the other stuff, or do I need the concept of the infinite? The answer is, well, what are you going whenever you add one more? Like, I just got the addition of one more, or the concept of one more. It's like, well, one more, where are you going, right? So the thought is that, so I've got less an argument for that we need it. I'm just giving an argument that we've already got it. And you can kind of deploy those sorts of concepts as need be. You can spend more time thinking about it. Maybe that's the question, which is, okay, maybe the way to reframe it, given the way that I think that I've answered the question, is less about whether or not we need the concept and whether or not we need to think more about the concept, whether or not we need to really ruminate on it, or whether or not we just need to get to work on it. And I guess part of the question here is, well, what's the purpose? What are we doing, right? I mean, are we needing to weather a storm, or weather some bit of fortune casting something our way, or are we working on perfecting a tradition of philosophy? And I think that if we're doing the former, then you know what, the rough and ready concept of the sage is enough, and you don't need to perfect it and things like that. Whereas if you're in a debate with an academic skeptic, or if you're talking to to another kind of deontologist, you need that concept. So a lot of it just depends on what kinds of purposes we've got there. Given the fact that I'm an academic and I'm constant, like every other colleague in my department thinks that I'm wrong about pretty much everything, I've got to defend it all, right? And so I've got to think about the concept of the sage. Why? Because the guy next door is going to ask me about it.
It's true.
You're not gonna. I mean, maybe not all practicing Stoics have to answer that question. I do.
It's really interesting to me to see that Seneca, I believe that he really believed that he could attain sagehood. Like, I mean, he
said that Cato was.
Yeah, I mean, and he, like, the last letter that I read from him was on a promising pupil, and he literally says in there, "I believe that you could do this. I really believe you could do this." And I guess the last question that I want to ask you before we bring everybody else is, I want to read something from Seneca's writings here, and kind of ask you to maybe comment on it, and perhaps what it is trying to get across to us, because you did quote it in your academic piece. And I'm also going to sidetrack any conversation about the clear parallels between this analogy that he gives us and a parable from Christ. But nonetheless, he says, God comes to men, nay, he comes nearer. He comes to men. He comes into men. No mind that has a God, let me rephrase that. No mind that has not God is good. Divine seeds are scattered throughout our mortal bodies. If a good husbandman receives them, they spring up in the likeness of their source and of a parity with those from which they came. If, however, the husbandmen be bad, like a barren or marshy soil, he kills the seeds and causes tares to grow up instead of wheat. When I read that, I'm brought into mind of just our human experience, that from time to time, thoughts come into our mind that call us to higher things, that pull us upwards. I mean, there are two examples that I can say of seeds that I know I received in my mind, and then I nourished them and they turned into something beautiful. The first was the poet and the sage. That started with a seed that then bloomed into a beautiful garden of thoughts that became a book, and that's to me is so representative of a divine seed that was sowed within my mind that then came out onto the page. And even with the walled garden, it's like, oh, okay, start a community, get Kai and Sharon, two of my favorite people, to mentor me and other people, and that all starts as a little thought in your mind that calls you to higher things, that if you nourish it well, and we all have these thoughts in our lives, I wonder if you could maybe comment a little bit further on what Seneca is talking about with those divine seeds scattered within our mortal bodies, that if we nourish them well, can take on a likeness of their source.
So I think that there are kind of two ways to take it. There's the way that I would like to take it, and then there's another way. The way I'd like to take it is that there's a kind of, I think that also this is a kind of a non-Stoic view, but at the very least, it's a kind of a Stoic-ish view, that we've got kind of innate ideas. So I think that Plato was onto something. I think that the sort of the nativist rationalist tradition is a good tradition. The Stoics could be amenable to it, but it also looks like they're kind of quasi-empiricists. It looked like they kind of go back and forth about it. It looked like that debate was one that was kind of internal to the Stoic school. But so if we're kind of nativists, then the divine seeds are in some ways things that are growing in our souls, qua souls. And our capacity to be able to reason, we're sensitive to things that call to us and call to our reason in terms of us assenting to the truth, and dissenting to the false, and suspending judgment with what's in question. That's just the nature of our minds, and our capacity to discern that is something that comes along with having mind. So that's my nativist inclination. And again, there are moments, again, we don't have a lot from the Stoics along those lines. Again, I'm more inclined to think that they're not nativists. So that's if the Stoics did what I think is right, they'd be nativists, but it's not entirely clear that they are. There's another line of interpretation that Plutarch imputes to the Stoics and also imputes to some other practicing Platonists, which is the following kind of perspective on one's wisdom and on one's capacities, which is that fortune, we have to thank fortune for making us immune to fortune. If you've read the beginning of our Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, you see a lot of thank yous in there. And the fact that he had to kind of walk a kind of a weirdly narrow path to be able to achieve the kind of intellectual self-possession that he needed in order to be the person that he was. He was lucky that he wasn't tempted to hit somebody, and he's lucky that he wasn't distracted by physics and weird puzzles in logic and things like that. There were all sorts of ways that he could have been pulled off the path, or had the wrong teacher, or had someone or develop a bad habit at the wrong time. And it turns out that fortune made it so that the right people were in his path at the right time, so that he was able to cultivate certain kinds of capacities to be able to then make himself immune to fortune. So we must thank fortune to be able to for having made us immune to fortune. That's Plutarch's gloss on a kind of a Stoic thought. And again, Plutarch thinks that that's bonkers, and he thinks that that's silly and things like that. But I think that there's something deep about that. Now, again, I think that, and by the way, these two views are not, my nativist view and this sort of Plutarchian view are consistent at the very least. But at the very least, the other one doesn't rely on, this one doesn't rely on, the Plutarchian one doesn't rely on nativism. But the Plutarchian view is, look, you had divine seeds, these moments of clarity come your way. And it depends on what you do with them. It's up to you as to what you do with these moments of clarity that come your way. They can pass by and you just say, hey, just getting on with my thing. And you just say, that was weird, or whatever, right? Or you're inspired by these moments of clarity. And you're made better by the company that you keep and the company that you choose. And so in this regard, we develop our Stoic virtues in some ways because of the fact that we had some kind of luck. I myself was very lucky that I had excellent teachers when I was an undergraduate. I was more of a kind of a debater. Like, I liked philosophy and these sorts of things really more because I just liked getting people's goat and being like, gotcha. My teachers were like, you're very skilled, but an asshole. And we need to work on both of those things. We need to improve the skills and maybe take care of the asshole thing. And, I'm working on both, but the crucial thing is that, look, if philosophy and the work of philosophy isn't for the sake of improving ourselves, not just improving our lives, but just improving who we are, the kind of person that we are. If philosophy kind of doesn't do that for us, and it's just an occasion for us to exercise a kind of, just a sort of an exercise of our mere intelligence, that in some ways is a shame. It feels like an opportunity lost. And so I myself consider myself very lucky that I had people in my path who occasioned these moments where the divine was kindled in me. Now, again, I'm not a believer in the divine, but whatever that reason was kindled in me, and a kind of change was motivated. In this regard, when the trouble with Seneca's analogy is that you've got good men and bad men, antecedently, that have these sparks fall on them, these seeds fall on them. I would change it. I would say an attentive or an inattentive person, someone who can see the seed, and someone who attends to it and tends it. and someone who is tending to other things.
Well, look,
because it's in the attending and the tending of the divine seed that we're made good or bad.
Scott, I just want to thank you for being here today. This has been such a pleasure, and I really want to make sure that we have enough time to let everybody ask questions. But yeah, thank you.
You've been listening to the Walled Garden Podcast. If you'd like to attend any of our free meetups and events, or if you'd like to get one-on-one mentoring with either Sharon Lebell, Kai Whiting, or myself, just go to thewalledgarden.com. But for now, don't forget to nourish those gardens in your mind.